What's up, guys? Doing a quick video here on the difference between inherited obligation and inherited value. A lot of times you think about inheritance in object-oriented programming, but what a lot of people may not contemplate, at least I didn't early on, is the fact that there is a distinction between inherited obligation and inherited value. Right? So when you declare a class as a member of a given type union, typically with that type union is coming in inherited obligation. That's something that you have the burden of fulfilling in order to be a member of that type union. And in so doing, you make all code that needs to consume that type union easier to implement because it doesn't have to be aware of the specific implementations or strategies available, right? It just needs to call a common interface and it knows that obligation will be adhered to by any member of that type union. And so you're providing value as a member of that type union when you fulfill that obligation, right? So abstract classes and templates are, on the other hand, are providing you inherited value. They're giving you something doing something for you to reduce the cost or burden of fulfilling an obligation, right? So those two things are important to be aware of. So here, for example, we have a key binding interface. This has a select method on it to select a key, and then we have a example of inherited value where we're going to provide a default strategy for that obligation to sort of ease the burden of fulfilling that obligation. Now, one thing to note that's really important is that just because I have two contracts that have the same method signature with the same name, this is very important, does not mean they are conceptually the same. It does not mean they're the same contract unless they explicitly declare that. So for example, if this says it extends, this wouldn't be valid, obviously, just looking at the name, but if this says it extends key binding, then that's a declarative way of saying that this is conceptually the same as this. These two methods are conceptually the same. Now, obviously, I wouldn't do that because my Apple selector is not a key binding. So that's important. If I come in here and I define an implementation of both key binding and Apple selector strategy, that's impossible for me to do because there's no way for me to know at invocation time which of those two concerns the consumer is intending for me to satisfy. And since they're conceptually different, the implementation would have to be different, right? So understanding when things are conceptually different is important, and what your true conceptual obligation is. Just because the method name is the same doesn't mean it's the same conceptual obligation. And importantly, I've seen code where the service code will actually look at some sort of a context in which it's being executed and then use that to get at the code that's calling it and try and figure out why it's being called and then implement the appropriate concern. Like really next level bad, okay? Because at that point, your calling code is always coupled to your service. It has to be aware of the concern that it needs, not the implementation, and that's important. But the service code should never be aware of the client code, right? The biggest issue there is that your service is now limited in what it can support. It can only support one client, at which point it might as well just be embedded within that client because it's not able to be invoked by other clients. It's not extensible, right? You can't reuse it without updating the service to be aware of the new clients that are consuming it, right? Which sort of defeats the purpose of a service. So, okay, yeah, this actually is sort of important to understand that there are two forms of inheritance. There's inherited obligation and inherited value, and conceptual obligation is a thing. So that's it. Peace.